Welcome back to the newest series on Spectre Creative, Modern Star Wars Action Figures, the series! And by modern, I mean the figures that started coming out in 1995, which is kind of funny because here in 2021, 1995 is farther back than 1978 was when the original line came out. But it's interesting how the modern figures have become kind of an icon, there we go, into themselves. So before we jump into the third episode, I want to talk about my rules, my order. And these are, of course, as collectors, we all make our own rules about what we collect. And I think it's important for me to be upfront about this because of what's going to be featured in this series. So yes, like all other action figure collectors out there, there's things I collect and things I don't collect. So while I do get some prequel figures, I am OCD adamant about original trilogy. So nothing against the prequels or the sequels or expanded universe, but for me personally, I decided it was going to be about the original trilogy only, and that's what's going to be featured on this series. So we're going to go through every original trilogy figure release from 1995 through current. And as I reviewed last time, we were up to Wave 2, which got split in half. Some of the figures shipping early and some of the figures shipping later. And between those, so between the figures that were meant for Wave 2, we got an interesting release, our first figure and vehicle. And if a vehicle came with a figure, I snatched it up because that fell into my rules. I decided early on I was going to get every single original trilogy figure. And all of this happened around the birth of the internet in 95. And yes, I know it's not like actually the original start of the very first internet. I know that happened in 69. But this is when the internet kind of became mainstream, or at least when it started to become available for teenagers in the 90s, which is what I was. And the internet was how I was learning now for the first time about new Star Wars releases, and there were websites popping up. I remember in particular there was one called Sir Steve's Guide, and it was one of the first places I saw images of Wave 2, which was the Empire Strikes Back wave. And wow, did I stare at these images forever. I remember printing them out and putting them in a 3-ring binder, and at night, I would open this binder up and just stare at these upcoming figures, because this was the first time we were getting new Star Wars toys, and it felt like forever. Now, along with the individual figure releases, there were vehicles, and these came out day and date with Wave 1 for Plano Set, which is when stores switch over. And for the first release of vehicles for what became Power of the Force 2, they were all reissues of vehicles from the vintage line from 10 years earlier, including the Falcon, the X-Wing, here the TIE Fighter, and all of the photo, they use the current figures, the Power of the Force 2 figures in the images. Interesting, since the TIE Fighter and the AT-ST didn't have drivers at the time, so they didn't have figures for those. But the land speeder is easy to put Obi-Wan and Luke in there, and for photo reasons for the cover of the box. And it's very interesting how these vehicle tools survived. The fact that they were still available. I don't know if they remade them based on old vehicles or they actually had the original tools. Tools, as a reminder, these giant metal molds used to make toys that you have to inject hot molten plastic into. This is an injection mold machine. So the tool is placed in this machine and the plastic is injected in it, and that's how you get the shape of the toy, whether it's a Luke Skywalker or a Snowspeeder or a Millennium Falcon or whatever it is. All plastic toys are basically made the same. And for the most part, tools aren't kept more than 3 to maybe 5 years because it's really expensive to store them. And honestly, the reason I'm showing you pictures of Hong Kong harbors because, well, some of them are just thrown into the harbor, and a lot of them are actually sold as anchors for boats. A lot of boats have old toy tools that they use for anchors, just because these are giant pieces of metal. All right, so back to what's going on with the releases. So between Wave 2 and the other half of Wave 2, the Star Wars Insider magazine came out and featured a look at upcoming figures And back then, you could actually buy figures through the Star Wars Insider if you were a member of the fan club, which obviously, of course, I was, card-carrying member there. And they had the power of the Force to speeder bike with Biker Scout. And this was way before it was announced anywhere else or available in stores. I don't know if it was an error that they went out so early with this, but I was like, whoa, a new figure. Even though he comes with a bike, I want it now. So I quickly ordered it and waited and waited and waited, and it took months and months and months and months. And finally, I even got an apology from the Star Wars Insider Fan Club that they didn't mean to pre-sell it as early as they did. That was an error, and they sent me a gift certificate to soothe my pain, I guess you could say. I remember it was a $15 gift certificate, and it was handwritten on a pink piece of cardstock, which I thought was it looked like someone just printed it out of a printer. But eventually I got it, which was awesome because I waited, and I did get it before it hit retail, which was cool, because there's nothing like getting a toy early. That's like one of the coolest feelings. And, of course, I really liked the speeder bike, but as I mentioned, I was in it for the figures. Vehicles were cool, and I do own a few vehicles, but I was really all about the figures. So I kind of considered the speeder bike just an accessory to the figure. Even though in this case, the figure, well, he kind of needed the accessory. So unlike the original vintage speeder bike, where the Scout Trooper would sit on top of it with what's called a T-bar attachment, where he would just slide onto it, and this would really allow almost any figure to slide onto it, and his legs would be up front, sticking out towards the handlebars in the front of the speeder, which, was not exactly movie accurate, but neither was sliding a figure inside of a Tauntaun through a trap door on the top. I mean, they made accommodations back in the day. The new figures, much like when they did Luke and Leia on the speeder bike, all had bendy knees. They had knee articulation, which was a first for Star Wars. These were the first Star Wars figures to ever have knee articulation, which was, in a way, mind-blowing. I mean, now we have these fully articulated vintage figures with 22 points of articulation, but back then, adding knee joints was pretty impressive. But the first attempt to do knee-jointed figure on the Scout Trooper, well, it left him a little questionable when he wasn't on the speeder, because his legs were really posed to be on that speeder. So his hands were in permanent gripping the handlebar position, and his legs were in kind of permanent straddling the bike position. He looked great on the bike, but without the bike, a little odd. Another odd detail is that his gun was in his holster permanently and painted white. It didn't get a deco hit. It was just a white blaster in his white holster. Later figures obviously would get a removable gun in the holster on his leg. But so he didn't come with a blaster. He didn't come with an accessory. The only accessory was his bike. So his bike kind of was his gun, which, made sense. So unlike the vintage figure, he could actually ride his bike correctly in movie-accurate look. It's also interesting that it was years and years before we got a single carded Scout Trooper in the Power of the Jedi line. I think that Hasbro was looking at this first release of Scout Trooper with the speeder bike as the release of this figure. The idea that figures were going to get re-released over and over again and get updates, new sculpts, new packaging really wasn't something going on when the Power of the Force 2 was out. Those figures were kind of one and done. We're going to do Scout Trooper and move on. We're not going to do him again. We're going to do Tatooine Luke and not do him again. It took a while before this sort of self-imposed Hasbro rule was broken, and it took until Power of the Jedi before we got a single-carded Scout Trooper. Because, the Scout Trooper with the speeder bike was considered, at the time, the definitive release for this character. Eventually, we would get amazing releases. The 3 3/4 Black Series figure, which actually originally came with a speeder bike. He's perfect. Not only can he sit on the bike correctly, but he can turn his head correctly because of a new ball joint that they added to it, and the speeder bike was retooled a little bit. Well, actually, it was a brand new speeder bike. This wasn't just a re-release of the vintage one. So there we go. We had our very first Return of the Jedi figure, and the collection was growing. Now it was time to start looking for the rest of Wave 2 before moving on to Wave 3. Exciting times.